Okay, good morning. So chapter 8 is the introduction of metabolism. So we're starting to change gears a little bit here and get into some processes that will occur within the cell. And metabolism is a big part of how cells are able to function. And the laws of thermodynamics are actually going to relate to biological processes in the sense that energy used by living things demonstrates the first law of thermodynamics. And the first law of thermodynamics is that energy can be transferred or transformed, but it cannot be created nor destroyed. And what this means is we are taking energy for our cells when we eat food, gets broken down into nutrients, and those nutrients then get transported to our cells, which then will use those nutrients in order to produce energy for themselves, in order to do things like protein synthesis, or replicate, or go through cell division, and things like that. So the conversion of energy to thermal energy released as heat by living things demonstrates the second law of thermodynamics, which is every energy transfer or transformation increases entropy, and entropy is disorder in the universe. And that's what heat is. It's coming off as sort of this disordered form of energy. So how do the laws of thermodynamics relate to biological processes? Well, the first law is that we take chemical energy and we use that energy, we shift it. And the second law of thermodynamics is that we release some of the energy in the form of heat, which is increasing the overall entropy in the universe. So metabolism is the totality of an organism's chemical reactions. These are all the chemical reactions that occur inside a cell. It is an emergent property of life that arises from an orderly interaction between molecules. Metabolism is going to be a series of metabolic pathways, and metabolic pathways are specific molecule is altered in a series of steps to produce some type of product. Each step will be catalyzed by a specific enzyme, and an enzyme is going to be a biological catalyst. We'll talk more about enzymes a little bit later in this particular chapter. And an enzyme is essentially, as I just said, it's a biological catalyst, and that biological catalyst is going to speed up the specific chemical reactions. So if we look at a metabolic pathway here, you can see you have, substrate A, that's your starting molecule. The enzyme will convert it to substrate B, which then another enzyme will convert it to substrate C in the second reaction. And then a third enzyme will convert substrate C to the final product, which would be D in the third reaction. So when we talk about metabolism, we can talk about two types of pathways. The first is catabolic pathways. Catabolic pathways will release energy by breaking down complex molecules into simpler compounds. And what this means is you take a molecule like glucose and you break down that glucose molecule in order to produce ATPs, which is the energy source for cells. That would be a catabolic pathway. Cellular respiration is the breakdown of glucose in the presence of oxygen under aerobic conditions. That's what presence of oxygen means, aerobic. And this is an example of a pathway that is catabolism. On the flip side, anabolic pathways are consuming energy to build complex molecules. So, unlike catabolic pathways, which are releasing energy, anabolic reactions are consuming energy. And what we mean by building up complex molecules, this would be taking, say, amino acids and forming bonds between them in order to make a functional protein. That would be an anabolic pathway. Typically in catabolic pathways, you are breaking bonds and you are releasing energy. In anabolic pathways, you are forming bonds and therefore require the input of energy. Now, catabolic pathways are described as quote unquote downhill reactions, whereas anabolic reactions are described as uphill. Living things use energy released from the downhill reactions of catabolic pathways to power the uphill reactions of anabolic reactions. And bioenergetics is the study of how energy flows through living organisms. So this is the particular area of biology that looks at how overall, how is energy moving? So what is energy? Energy is the capacity to cause change. It can be used to do work. It can also move matter against opposing forces, such as gravity or friction. Energy can exist in various forms. Living cells must transform energy from one form to another to do the work of life. The first form of energy is kinetic energy. This is the energy that's associated with motion. Moving objects perform work by imparting motion to other matter. For example, water gushing through dams turns turbines. That's kinetic energy. Thermal energy is a form of kinetic energy that's associated with the random movement of atoms or molecules. Thermal energy in transfer of one object to another is called heat. Light is another type of energy that can be harnessed to do work. And in a future chapter and a little bit in this chapter, we'll talk about one way that we can produce energy is through photosynthesis, where we take light energy and convert it into chemical energy. Potential energy, this is energy that matter possesses because of its location or structure. For example, water behind a dam possesses potential energy because of the altitude above sea level. Molecules possess energy due to the arrangement of electrons in bonds between their atoms. Another way to talk about potential energy is that this is stored up energy. This is energy that is stored within a cell in this respect, and can be used at a later time, can be converted to kinetic energy. So chemical energy is potential energy available for the release of in a chemical reaction. Going back to our example of glucose are high in chemical energy because energy is released as they are broken down into simpler products. When we go through a catabolic reaction of glucose, we are releasing the chemical energy, the potential energy within the glucose molecule to be used by another component of the cell. Now, the first law of thermodynamics does say that energy can be converted from one form to another. For example, chemical energy from food is used to perform the work of climbing up a diving platform. The kinetic energy of the muscle movement is transformed into potential energy as the diver climbs higher above the water. The potential energy is then transformed back to kinetic energy as the diver falls back down to the water. So the first law of thermodynamics, again, this is the energy of the universe is constant. And what that means is that energy can be transferred and transformed, but it cannot be created nor destroyed. The first law is also called the principle of the conservation of energy. The second law of thermodynamics, during every energy transfer or transformation, some energy is converted to thermal energy and lost as heat. And when it's lost as heat, it is unavailable to do work. So according to the second law of thermodynamics, every energy transfer or transformation increases entropy of the universe. Entropy is a measure of molecular disorder or randomness. Living organisms will increase the disorder of their surroundings through their metabolism. For example, the breakdown of food releases heat and small molecules such as CO2, which also gets put back out into the universe. Processes that increase entropy of the universe can occur spontaneous. A spontaneous process occurs without energy input, and they can either happen quickly or slowly. Processes that decrease entropy are non-spontaneous, and they require the input of energy. So let's talk a little bit about biological order and disorder. Cells will create ordered structures from less organized starting materials. For example, simple molecules are ordered into amino acids, which then are assembled into ordered polypeptides or proteins. Polypeptide and protein means the same. Complex or ordered structures are also produced from simpler starting materials at the organismal level. Now, biologists will follow the energy and entropy changes during chemical reactions to determine whether they require an input of energy or occur spontaneously. And what we look at is the free energy change. The free energy change is delta G. Gibbs free energy, G, can be simplified and referred to as free energy. Free energy is the portion of a system's energy that can do work when temperature and pressure are uniform throughout the system. And this is a condition that happens in a living cell. Change in free energy during a reaction is related to temperature and changes in enthalpy and entropy. So in order to figure out the change in free energy, you would take the change in enthalpy, which is your total energy, and subtract the temperature in Kelvin and the change in entropy, which is delta S. And that would equal the change in free energy. The change in free energy for a process can be used to determine whether it is spontaneous or not. If the change in free energy is negative for all spontaneous processes, if the change in energy is 0 or positive, it is for non-spontaneous processes. Every spontaneous process decreases the system's free energy. Spontaneous processes can be harnessed by the cell to perform work. So, if the change in free energy represents the difference between free energy in the final state and the free energy in this initial state, and that could be shown in this formula here, where we have the change in free energy is what was it in the final state minus the initial state. And again, if your change is negative, it is a spontaneous process. If it is 0 or positive, it is a non-spontaneous process. If a reaction has a negative change in free energy, the system loses free energy and becomes more stable. So free energy can be thought of as a measure of a system's stability. Unstable systems will have higher change in energy or change in free energy, or free energy, sorry, and tend to become more stable over time. For example, a diver on a platform is less stable than when floating in water. A drop of concentrated dye is less stable than when it dispersed randomly throughout a liquid. A glucose molecule is less stable than simpler molecules into which it can be split further. Now, equilibrium, this is the point at which forward and reverse reactions occur at the same rate, and it describes a state of maximum stability. Systems never spontaneously move away from equilibrium. A process is spontaneous and can perform work only when it is moving towards a state of equilibrium. So how can we apply the concept of free energy to metabolism, which again is the chemistries of life's processes, meaning all the chemical reactions that occur in a cell? We will use the terms exergonic and endergonic to describe this. So chemical reactions can be classified based on their free energy changes. An exergonic reaction, meaning energy outward, proceeds with a net release of free energy to the surroundings. An endergonic reaction, or energy inward, absorbs free energy from the surroundings. In other words, an exergonic reaction is releasing free energy, and an endergonic reaction is absorbing free energy. In an exergonic reaction, the products store less free energy than the reactants. Because the free energy is negative, exergonic reactions occur spontaneously. Recall that the term spontaneous means that the reaction is energetically favorable, not that it will occur rapidly or randomly. The magnitude of free energy determines the maximum amount of work an exergonic reaction can perform. For example, for each mole of glucose broken down during cellular respiration, 686 kilocalories of energy is available for work. Chemical products of respiration store 686 kilocalories less free energy per mole than the reactants, because that's what's available to be released as free energy. Breaking bonds during chemical reactions does not release energy. It actually requires energy. If the products are of lower free energy than the reactants, potential energy is released when new bonds are formed after the original bonds break. In endergonic reactions, the products store more free energy than the reactants. Because free energy is positive, endergonic reactions are non-spontaneous. The magnitude of free energy determines the quantity of energy required to drive an endergonic reaction. For example, to produce glucose and oxygen from CO2 and water requires the input of 686 kilocalories. The products of photosynthesis store 686 kilocalories more free energy per mole than the reactants. The reaction is powered by converting light energy into chemical energy. So essentially what's happening with plants through the process of photosynthesis is they are taking light energy, converting it to chemical energy, and storing the equivalent of 686 kilocalories per mole of energy within glucose molecule. Then cells like our cells will then take that glucose molecule and harvest that energy, meaning releasing 686 kilocalories of energy to be used by our cells. And then we release CO2, which then goes back to the plants to be able to make new glucose. This is how you're shifting energy from one form to another. Now, reactions in a closed system, such as an isolated hydroelectric system, eventually reach equilibrium and can do no work. The chemical reactions metabolism are reversible, but never reach equilibrium in a living cell. This is one of the defining features of life. Like an open hydroelectric system, cells allow materials to flow in and out. The flow of materials prevents metabolic equilibrium. You don't want metabolic equilibrium because that means the cell cannot do work, and that would enable a cell to die. But by allowing the flow of materials, by preventing the flow of materials from reaching equilibrium, this enables cells to continue to do work. Like a multi-step open hydroelectric system, a catabolic pathway in a cell releases free energy in a series of reactions. Okay, so now we're going to take the idea of being able to store free energy, and now we're going to apply that to ATP. Okay, and ATP powers cellular work by coupling exergonic and endergonic reactions together. A cell does three main kinds of work: chemical react, which is pushing endergonic reactions; transport work, which is pumping substance across membranes in a direction of spontaneous movement; and the mechanical work, which would be beating cilia or contracting muscle cells. Cells manage energy resources to do work through energy coupling, the use of an exergonic process to drive an endergonic one. Most energy coupling in cells is mediated by ATP. So what is ATP? ATP is essentially the energy source that we find inside of cells. It is adenosine triphosphate, and it is composed of a ribose molecule, which is a sugar. It's a pentose sugar, 5 carbons. An adenine, which is a nitrogen base. We'll see this guy again when we get to talking about DNA. It's one of the nitrogen bases of DNA. And 3 phosphate groups. In addition to energy coupling, ATP functions as one of the nucleoside triphosphates used to make RNA. So here we have the nitrogen base, our adenine, our ribose, our 5-carbon sugar, and then 3 phosphate groups. Energy is released from ATP when the terminal phosphate bond is broken by hydrolysis, the terminal being the 3rd phosphate. Hydrolysis is the addition of water molecules to it. And what happens is when you add the water, you will separate the phosphate off of the ATP molecule, making adenosine diphosphate, which is ADP, and a released phosphate. But what you've also done is you've released the energy in this bond right here as free energy, which can be used by the cell. The energy does not come directly from the phosphate bonds, but rather the bond holding the phosphate to the other phosphate. ATP releases more energy with the loss of a phosphate than most other molecules could deliver. Repulsion between the negative charges of the 3 phosphate groups creates a lot of potential energy. The triphosphate tail is the chemical equivalent of a compressed spring. Now, how ATP provides energy that performs work? Cellular work, whether it be mechanical work, transport, or chemical, is powered by ATP hydrolysis, the use of ATP for energy. In the cell, energy from an exergonic hydrolysis of ATP is used to drive endergonic reactions. Overall, the coupled reactions are exergonic.